and welcome. I'm Karen Panetta, and I'm the IEEE Awards Board Chair. Joining me here today is the 2022 Jack S. Kilby Signal Processing Medal recipient, sponsored by Apple, Dr. David L. Donahoe. Dr. Donahoe, congratulations.
Thank you.
And joining us also, our sponsor from Apple is Alex Acero. Greetings, Alex.
Thank you for having me. Congratulations, David.
So today we're celebrating your work for groundbreaking contributions to sparse signal recovery and compressed sensing. So the first thing we need to ask you is, can you describe to, in general terms, what is sparsity?
Well, the sparsity model for signals is one that says that you may have a long signal vector, but only a small fraction of the entries are really important and with significant values. The rest are mostly zero. So you could think of looking at the night sky and you see some points of light, but mostly you see black. Let's say you're out of an urban area. Or you could think of looking at a wavelet transform of a signal, and you might see some very big coefficients in strategic entries, but mostly you see small coefficients or things that are just too negligible to notice. The principle of sparsity is also related to things that have come up in image coding over the years. For example, the discrete cosine transform assumes that in the transform domain, there's small coefficients in most of the entries. And so you don't need most of the data in order to represent the signal.
So you're using the most pertinent information to help reduce the amount of information that you need. Is that a good way to encapsulate?
You're deciding that even though the signal seems to be very lengthy or high dimensional, the action is carried by a small fraction of heavy hitters within that vector.
All right, heavy hitters, that's what we need.
Right? And so it's just better to look for the heavy hitters and exploit the heavy hitters rather than treat every coefficient as being potentially very important. Just find the ones that are actually important and focus on them.
There we go. So let's talk about how you use these heavy hitters. You've used them across many different arenas, but let's start with oil. So, first of all, you do statistics. How did you even get into oil? What even brought you to that arena?
Well, the oil exploration industry was, I think, one of the very, very earliest beneficiaries of the signal processing revolution and the data science revolution. So already in the 70s and 80s, they were doing really, really interesting work in signal processing. Much of it was happening in their own journals, like the Journal of Geophysics. And so the IEEE journals had some presence in that, but it was a lot of, the business and was in a lot of their private research and so on. They had a model called layer cake geology, which dictated that signals that come back in reflection series from beneath the surface of, say, Saudi Arabia or the Gulf Coast in Texas or off the coast of Norway, that those would be sparse signals. So the sparsity was important, at least for a time, in getting to the next generation of imaging that they do. And I worked in that business because I was just after college. I lived at home with my parents in Houston, and I paid back my father for college tuition by working in the oil business.
There we go. All right. So every parent out there is going to send their kid into sparsity and signal processing. So
yeah, it was great. People can't imagine how good it is to work when you're young and learn about ideas that other people have come up with and get them into you early. It's obviously that's important in the performing arts.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be a dancer, you should start early. If you want to be a singer, you should start early. If you want to know everything in signal processing, start early, but don't only be academic. Be a mixture of academic and industry, because actually industry is cutting edge in many dimensions.
I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of times there's that dichotomy between the academic side and the industry side. And I think that, you've just hit the nail on the head, that you really need to be both to be impactful, which, you have had an amazing, impactful career. I want to talk about the impact that you've made on magnetic resonance imaging. For, millions of people every day get MRIs. And most people that I know dread them. We dread them for the time it takes to sit still that long. And so can you talk a little bit how your contributions here have revolutionized and made it better for all of us, especially children, to get an imager today?
So yeah, first of all, I want to affirm what you say, that there have been really important improvements in medical imaging that you could even call revolutionary. So that's completely fine. To say, that I have revolutionized it. So now we have to go back into the whole issue of, there is an industry of magnetic resonance imaging. And there are a lot of very, very talented, skilled people working in that industry. I've been to their major conferences. And I would say the important point is that they're aware of what's going on in academia, and they're very incentivized in that industry to come up with ways to improve patient experiences. It's a business that makes a lot of money, and they're able to pay their engineers extremely well for making improvements in their systems. And so they're ready to eat up good ideas from academia. So let's just make that very clear. And then a second thing is that the lucky case in my situation is that there's a very great MRI lab at Stanford. Stanford has a tremendous relationship with the major MRI manufacturers, which include Siemens, Philips, and GE. And they have their equipment on the campus, and not just being used for patients, but actually being used in research. And so it was possible on this particular campus, where I stand at the moment, actually, to implement things like I could be scanned and it could be implemented on me, for example. Wow. Because they had extra equipment that was only being used for that and not for patient care. And that was donated by the manufacturer. So it's very, very important that there's an industry side of this. It's also very important that in this particular case, there was an academic idea that could be shown to be applicable by people in industry. And I think that's because I had been working in signal processing on other things. So I understood a lot of practical issues that allowed the theory to correctly model some things that were relevant to industry. So they understood what the theory was saying. And a very, very bright graduate student at Stanford, Michael Lustig, who was in IEEE, was able to take the theory that I was telling him and that he was learning from other mathematicians like Emmanuel Condez and Terry Tao. He could explain it because he had the IEEE background. He could explain it to industry. And then many, many people working in industry worked very hard on this. So it was definitely a partnership. story.
And the result of that partnership is now MRIs. You can get the same quality MRI.
So you need to understand that probably you've heard that the path to FDA approval is not that easy. Of course, maybe we've got the wrong idea because of the tremendous speed at which the vaccines for COVID were rolled out. We've got the idea, but those were actually not rolled out as FDA approved treatments. They were first rolled out under some emergency use because the whole economy was shut down, right? But generally speaking, it takes years and years to get new ideas approved by FDA. It would require a massive investment of industry to make that happen. In this case, it was a little bit more than 10 years, maybe 11 years from publication in an IEEE publication of my paper on compressed sensing to there being an FDA approval for, I think, what's called a 510K certificate. And so that it just happened to be that the planets aligned and could make it happen that quickly. It seemed unprecedented for things to get implemented that quickly. And just a few years later, we got some information from Philips that they were totaling up applications in the millions of this technology on their scanners. And presumably it's the same with the other major manufacturers like GE and Siemens.
Alex?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Acero, and I work for Apple. I'm here representing Apple, who is the sponsor of the Jack Kilby Signal Processing Medal. Congratulations to Professor Donoghue. I'm here not too far from the Stanford campus in Apple Park, and this is such a great pleasure for Apple and for myself included, because I remember reading the paper back in 2006, a little bit afterwards, and having been in signal processing myself for all of my career, I really enjoyed that. I served even as president of the society and many other roles. One of the questions that I'd like to ask you that struck me when I read your paper a few years ago was, you take all these samples, let's say you're taking a picture in your phone, and you take all of these samples, all of these pixels, and you have like a big file if it is uncompressed, but most of the time you compress it with something like JPEG, so that it's much smaller. If you're doing that, why are you doing all that work? I forgot the exact quote. Why are you doing all that work of sampling every single pixel if you're going to throw away most of that information? Is there some other way? And that's essentially battling the Nyquist theorem for all of us that are signal processors, where you need to sample at least twice as fast as the highest frequency. But what compressed sensing said is that, no, you don't need to sample that much. Where did you get that intuition?
Well, luckily, so first of all, you've put it very well. The key thing is, since we know most images are compressible, it seems strange that you would be forced to make all the measurements that conventional MRI scanners were measuring. And it seems that by pedantically sampling the frequency domain at every of the Fourier frequencies, they were just, spending a lot of time and imposing on patients long delays. So the intuition of compressibility really comes from the fact that I had been working in signal processing for years before this and publishing in some of the IEEE journals on using wavelet transforms to compress signals. So I definitely was very, very aware of the ease with which transform domain coding could compress a signal. And I was very aware of, if you work in a transform domain, there's a few coefficients that are heavy hitters, and most of the coefficients contribute almost nothing. That's the basis of discrete cosine transform and of wavelet transform coding and zero tree coding and a lot of things that have made their way into important standards. So I got the intuition because I was allowed to publish papers in IEEE journals and work on signal processing. And so I knew all of that just in my bones, for years and years before this particular application came up.
So one of the things that struck me when I read the original paper is something that appeared not very related to the concept of compression, which is this L2 norm versus the L1 norm. This is probably a little bit more technical, but I wonder if you could try to explain to our audience why is this L1 norm and what it is, and why is it helping us get the sparsity in the signal?
Yeah, so for quite a few years, let's say, in the academic approach to signal processing, it was dominated by least mean square or least square processing ideas. And something having to do with least absolute would have been considered awkward and not as elegant and not as theoretically fulfilling. But there is one very important thing that you get when you do L1 based processing, is that in certain representations, like the wavelet representation, the L1 norm of the coefficient is going to induce you to do soft thresholding of a kind, so that if you see small coefficients, you map them to 0. And if you see big coefficients, you more or less leave them alone.
Mm-hmm.
That association of L1 with soft thresholding is crucial to all of this, because that is a kind of a compression. It's throwing away some coefficients. So often L1 minimization, when the vector is sparse looking, L1 minimization will produce a sparse result, somewhat even sparser than the original. L2 processing will not generally sparsify. And so the let's say popularity of L2 and mean square would have made it very, very hard to do compression in the way that compressed sensing works. So that it's true, as you say, that L1 is a very important part of the story. And it's that kind of trick that it causes this kind of thresholding in many of the places where it's used. I would like to also give credit here to people in neuroscience who had signal processing ideas for many years, but they're interested in the signal processing engine known as the brain. And they by, looking into the visual cortex of cats and monkeys, located that there's a kind of threshold device that all these neurons are producing, and that there's a sequence of signal processing steps going on, one of which is thresholding. So it's understood really that thresholding devices are fundamentally effective for signal processing. And so that was also very clear in my mind for many years before ever working on the compressed sensing problem.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, it's very lucky, I think, that we can make connections in the same way we spoke about academia and industry. We can make connections between, signal processing, math, and at the other extreme, neuroscience. Like, we can see a convergence of technologies. And to me, the amazing thing in the deep learning revolution is that the same soft threshold devices that are so successful in the brain and in compressed sensing are present in all these deep learning systems that are causing such a revolution in signal and image processing. So yeah, you've definitely pointed to something very important.
I was going to ask you about artificial intelligence. Go ahead,
I was going to say that that's the reason that I was interested in compressed sensitive because I've been working on speech recognition and neural networks and machine learning. And one of the things that struck me is our brain is essentially a gigantic set of neurons, billions, hundreds of billions connected, all of them with each other. If all of them had non-zero weights, just to power our brain, we need to eat like 10 to 100 times more. And the reason why that's okay is because it's very, very sparse, especially not the first layer, but after that. That means most of these coefficients, all these connections are basically zero. And that's why the brain is a very, very efficient compressed sensing machine in that sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that also, there have been, let's say, in neuroscience, there had been very important work suggesting that the brain would just melt unless it had thresholding devices all over the place. It's very important that most neurons are silent most of the time. Otherwise, the brain is already the most energy ravenous organism in the body, but it's maybe 1/100th as energy demanding as it would otherwise be. Right. So you're definitely onto something there, and so that's a connection sparsity rather than signal sparsity. So what's very interesting is that the signal sparsity is also present in visual images. That's fundamental. And then connection sparsity is somehow the concepts and methods that are important in understanding something. They're sparsely connected. You don't need to know everything about all the irrelevant fields in order to understand the thing that you need to understand at the moment. But maybe later you'll need to understand something else. So in the morning, you're driving your car, you just need to understand those few things, and then later you're doing some engineering project and you're using some software to design something. You need to understand that that factorization into sparse components is just so crucial for neuroscience. And I mean, I hear, and Alex, you might be in a good place, or Karen might be in a good place, but I hear that there's a lot of improvements in AI at the edge, which are exploiting this exact idea to create create neural nets that use less power and operate more efficiently at the edge.
Right, and less parameters, because when you tell somebody, oh yeah, you've got 40 million parameters, I got it down to 1 million.
It's important. It's really important. If you're gonna distribute, the way Apple does, if you're gonna distribute, a billion devices out there. Here's my iPhone. If you're gonna distribute a billion devices and you can make them 10x, fewer components, then that's a gigantic win. Like for everybody, there's just less energy needed, and everyone's happier from that.
Yeah, and in fact, the latest iPhones can run neural speech recognition and neural speech synthesis on the phone itself, on a part of the chip called the Apple Neural Engine, which is specialized for neural network operations. But still, we had to use compression of all of the parameters, because even without that, it would not be possible to do this in real time.
So, yeah, that's
amazing.
Plus one on everything you're saying.
There you go. So let's back up. And talk about who were you before you became, you even went to college? What got you into this field in the first place? Who was it that said you should go into this field?
So my father was a physics professor at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Which
you had no choice.
I don't know if I would say I had no choice, but I was kind of bookish, and I just knew I was not very athletic, and I was I was good at like math contests and taking, or like a chemistry society contest or any of those things.
And just so you know, you can use the word nerd here. It's celebrated. So
Yeah. Okay. I was the kind of kid, like I had a slide rule. I went to the slide rule club. My father did a lot of computational physics, so I knew everything about like the computer center and hanging out with him. So an example I really remember, there used to be a programming language called APL, which had all of these features like map reduce it was invented in the 1960s. But I knew about map reduce when I was 14 or something in like 1971. So, but only because my father had a newsletter about the language APL that had puzzles, and he would bring them home and work them like while waiting for dinner. And in the puzzles, there would be things, what is the shortest piece of APL that can generate, the eigenvalues of a Toeplitz matrix or something. and so the thing with APL is that you could do such a thing in like 8 or 10 characters that it was very indecipherable, and they were all Greek symbols and things. But I knew about computing, let's say that. And I was not a social butterfly, we can say that.
But you are now. But you are now, because now you're in industry, you're an entrepreneur, you've been in hedge funds, you've been everywhere. So you have to have some social skills to get where you've got.
I get along with people, but I'm not sure that I could open doors through social skills that I have. Maybe the doors open because of technical skills. I don't know. Anyway, then I had various options for college, and my mother wanted me to go to Princeton, and then I ran a computer in the math department, which was PDP-11 running Unix, and that was supposedly the first Unix outside of Bell Labs. And so I knew C and shell scripting and so on when I was 17. And that was important. So in a way, before I did serious math, I already had done computing.
Good skills.
And I think that's actually a good combination. I think it's and maybe that's increasingly prevalent because computing is just so ubiquitous now. But I think it was rare at the time. So in my generation, people who had some serious math training, and Princeton was very serious in math. I mean, they still are, but nobody knew computers, not on the faculty nor in students. But there, I had to, back up the, hard drives onto tapes, and I had to write the first statistics software for the computer.
Tapes. What are those? People don't know what tapes are anymore.
And and it was a PDP-11 that you could hack there was a lunar lander game, and you could hack it by turning it into you could just pause the CPU and enter by hand more fuel into certain registers, and then turn the CPU on so you could cheat. Things like this. Gaming is an important engine of progress in education. It's under-recognized.
Okay, that's awesome.
And then I went to work in oil exploration after college, and I learned about the fundamental role of signal processing in discovering oil. and so many fascinating nonlinear signal processing things that were being considered. I also saw that industry had a lot more resources that they could bring to bear when they wanted to on things. And so you could be like a kid in a candy store and see things equipment wise that you could never see in an academic setting. And then that's very inspirational. So that was to see. I think it would be accurate to say it was like data science long before there was a Google or Facebook doing data science.
So let's close out and ask you this final question. What advice would you have for young people starting out? If you could, give any advice, what would you suggest?
Well, it's important to go a bit against the grain because there will be many other people going with the flow. So in my case, going against the grain was, I was learning computers before math and then doing some serious math, but then going to industry and learning signal processing. And this combination, I think, was probably very, very rare on the planet Earth at the time as a preparation, but it was, very helpful to me anyway. I don't know what the analogy would be today, but I do think that there's a lot of herding where people all want to do the exact same thing as what they just saw working for someone else. And I think if you would learn, so one way to be different would be read classic papers. Don't depend on things that just came down the internet today. Learn about things that no one would remember. Learn about a thing I did in my academic career is learn a lot about what was going on in the Soviet Union and understand the theorists in the Soviet Union had many, many fundamental advances. So learn something about other cultures and other fields. That's a way to go against the grain and to have knowledge that other people would not have.
Thank you. So we're hoping all of you out there that saw our live stream today will go against the grain and change the future and make impacts as wonderful as Dr. Donohue has have. I want to thank Alex Acero and Apple for sponsoring us today. And again, Dr. Donohue, thank you so much. And congratulations on being the recipient of the Jack S. Kilby Signal Processing Medal. And I hope to see you both out in our honors ceremony in California. So thank you all for joining us.
Congratulations again.
Thank you.